Welcome to the Shepherd Podcast. I'm your host. I'm Pastor Chris. Thank you so much for joining us for our episode today. The podcast is a way to help you to get to know some different people at Shepherd of the Hills, to explore some different issues, talk about some things that I think you would enjoy. And I'm really excited about today's guest. Colonel Mark Melcher served our armed forces for 38 years. He's recently retired from the military. He is a very involved member of our church and has been for quite a while. His wife is Andrea, and they have 3 children. They have Trent, Caroline, and Courtney. And so the Melcher family has been a big part of the ministry here, singing and serving in many other ways. And so today it's my great honor to welcome Colonel Mark Melcher to the podcast. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Pastor.
I mentioned your family. A recent big event for you guys was welcoming Trent home from Afghanistan.
Yes, sir.
How did that feel to receive him?
Fantastic. Safe and sound.
Yeah.
So he's been back for about a week.
Yeah.
And decompressing now.
Right.
Spent some time with him again today. So we're very thankful to God that he and many of our other, military members have successfally come home and safely. Yeah. So we're praying for the rest of them.
Absolutely. So glad that Trent made it home safely. Yeah. And 38 years in the military, that's quite a while.
It was.
Yeah. And today we want to talk about what you would call one of the highlights of your career when you served at Arlington National Cemetery.
Yes, sir. So I was deputy commander of the Air Force Presidential Honor Guard, and Arlington was probably about 65-70% of what we did, burials for Air Force members that were buried there. And through that time, I developed a very strong knowledge of who was buried at Arlington. And so what I developed was what I called a walking tour. When folks would come out and visit us, we would I would walk them around to these gravestones of famous Americans. And it took about 4 hours. This will not take that long. And I'm just going to do a short excerpt of that today. But love to do this. I've done for a number of organizations and school kids, etc. So
really looking forward to it. Now I must ask, this is a very special assignment to be at Arlington. How does a person get selected for that? How did that happen for you?
So it's a selective manning assignment in the Air Force, so you have to put in a package with a whole bunch of information, photos, etc., and then you're selected. And we selected usually about 3 of every 100 applications that we would get. So it was very selective. As you might, there are a lot of different factors: what the person looks like, how tall they are, their image, everything. It was big.
Wow. Well, really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Now, just so our audience knows, they're going to see the pictures in between us on the screen. We have a TV that we're looking at, so if you wonder what we're looking at, we're going to look at the pictures as you go through them. And would you please give us a tour?
Absolutely. Glad to do it, Pastor. So we'll start with how Arlington came about, just briefly, because a lot of people are unaware of this. Arlington House was built to house George Washington's heirlooms and memorabilia. It was built by his son, his adopted son, through Martha Washington, George Washington Parke Custis. And he built it on the heights above Washington, D.C. He and his wife had a number of children, daughters, and the oldest was Mariana Custis. Mariana Custis, as she reached her formative years, met a dashing young military officer, had attended West Point from Alexandria by the name of Robert E. Lee. May sound familiar, and it is. And she marries Robert E. Lee, and during their marriage, they move in and out of Arlington House a number of times during his 40-plus year career in the United States Army. In 1857, George Washington Parke Custis dies. He wills the home to Robert E. Lee and Mary. And shortly after this, the great unresolved issue of slavery rears its ugly head in our political history again. And in 1860, the Civil War begins to kick off, and shots are fired from Fort Sumter, and the war is on. Lee is offered command of the Union Army at that point from President Lincoln, And after a fitful night, considering that at Arlington House, Lee decides that he cannot accept that command because that army is going to march south through his home and into his home, Virginia. And so he resigns his commission and determines that he will, and he says this in his resignation letter, except in defense of my native state, I never again will draw my sword.
Wow.
Well, shortly after that, of course, the inevitable happens, and the Union Army marches south, and he takes command of the first, the Virginia Defense Forces, and then later on, of course, we know the entire Confederate Army. Shortly after that, as he moved, the Union Army takes command of Arlington House because if you've ever been to Arlington, and we'll see some pictures of this and you'll see why, the heights above Washington, D.C. is where Arlington is, and Arlington House was originally built. And so you would be able to just put cannon there and lob, shrapnel, et cetera, into the D.C. So it was a very strategic site. And so the Union Army had to take command of it, and they did. Mary, his wife, leaves, never to return, and the land is soon confiscated for lack of payment of taxes, which they couldn't pay because they weren't there.
Right.
So the United States government takes command of it. Interesting, about 3 or 4 years into the war, Montgomery Meigs, General Montgomery Meigs, is the quartermaster general of the Union Army, and he decides, he's from the state of Georgia, he stayed loyal to the Union, and he determines that Lee will never live in Arlington House again. And how he does that is he begins to bury Union soldiers in his front yard. And that is how Arlington came about.
Really?
Absolutely.
Wow.
So interesting. And I often say, if you've ever studied Lee, which I have done extensively, if he came back today, what was intended to be a slight and an insult to him, he would take as the greatest compliment you could have paid him.
Sure. Isn't it something how some things have very simple beginnings and what they can turn into?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely. So that's a little bit about how Arlington started. We'll start punching through. So this first picture is the post chapel at Fort Myer, which is attached to Arlington, if you will. It's an Army post. And this is right outside one of the gates to Arlington, and this is where we would do the funerals for the Air Force members before we brought the body out, put it on a caisson, and then marched it to its final resting place in Arlington.
Okay.
So that's Fort Myer Chapel, beautiful place, on a beautiful day.
Mm-hmm.
This is right inside the gate. This is one of the areas where the Spanish-American War dead are buried, and Spanish-American veterans. So
let me ask you, the tombstones there looks a lot like Fort Sam. Is that a uniform thing
that's
throughout?
Standard. Yeah, that's a standard, except interestingly, and I could go on forever, but there's one spot in the cemetery that's just Confederate dead that they were their bodies were exhumed and buried at Arlington to kind of bridge the gap. It was just post Spanish American War to kind of bring the South back into the fold, so to speak. They created a place called Jackson Circle, and those gravestones come to a point. Confederate buried. And they jokingly, when the joke, I think I'm pretty sure it's a joke, but maybe it was serious at the time. They asked, why are those gravestones different? And the Southerner said, well, it's to prevent the Union Army from sitting on the gravestones. So
that worked.
Some things die a slow death. Right. So this is our first stop, Abner Doubleday. Abner Doubleday. From the great state of Pennsylvania, graduated from West Point, and was a Union officer and actually served from the beginning of the war all the way through the end. So he was there at Fort Sumter when it was fired upon by General Beauregard and forces, including members of the Citadel, the student body at the Citadel, which is there in Charleston. So Doubleday rises in rank pretty quickly and becomes a major general and fights in all the major campaigns of the Civil War. Probably his most memorable and important days of his life was the first day at Gettysburg. First day at Gettysburg, He was a division commander under General John Reynolds, the Corps commander. And John Reynolds is killed early in the battle, and Doubleday has to take over the entire Corps. At that time, the Union Army was badly outnumbered, about 3-1. It was one of the few battles that at any point in time the Confederates actually outnumbered the Union troops. So he fought a delaying action, which was vital that day on the first day, because it allowed the rest of the Union Army to come up and take up positions on Culp's Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and then Little Round Top, which became the key points of the battlefield. The Confederates then were at a great disadvantage, and for the next 2 days pounded their head against those fortifications and were unable to defeat the Union. And of course, that becomes the turning point of the Civil War. Wow. After the war, Doubleday heads west and becomes the head of the first cable car company in San Francisco. And just one brief thing, Abner Doubleday is often, and you often see baseballs. In fact, I think you see there's a baseball at the base of that. That's a common thing because, the thought is, Abner Doubleday invented baseball. Nobody really invented baseball, but he certainly was key in popularizing it during the Civil War as a game that a lot of the troops played.
How about that?
Yeah. Next, Arthur MacArthur. You know a lot about his son, probably. Douglas MacArthur. His son is buried in a shrine at Norfolk. Douglas MacArthur also spent a lot of time in San Antonio growing up during his formative years when his dad was stationed at Fort Sam and attended Texas Military Institute, interestingly.
Yeah.
He tried to get into West Point when he was 17 at the kickoff of the Civil War. He's unable to do that, so he enlists from the state of Wisconsin, where he was from. And he is quickly commissioned. He moves up through the ranks and is commissioned a lieutenant at the age of 18. At that young age, he wins the Medal of Honor at Missionary Ridge, the highest military honor that we bestow on our members, fighting the Confederates in Tennessee at that battle. After the war, he leaves the military briefly, but loves the Army, too much a part of who he is. So he comes back in and makes it up through the ranks as a general, brigadier general during the Spanish-American War, and is the commander of the brigade that captures Manila during that war. He becomes the military governor and is at odds with the civilian governor, another famous American, William Howard Taft, also buried at Arlington, who eventually becomes president and then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, or justice on the Supreme Court. I don't think it was Chief Justice. They disagree on whether or not military, martial law needs to continue in the Philippines at that time. And Taft they don't get along very well. That's to come back to haunt him because in 1906, as the senior ranking member of the Army at that time, he is in line to become the chief of staff, essentially, of the Army, and Taft is the Secretary of War at the time. So MacArthur never gets to take on that role. And he dies in 1912 addressing his troops, his Civil War troops.
He died while addressing the troops?
Yeah. Arthur MacArthur. Great man. Claire Chenault. Claire Chenault was a school teacher and a principal in Louisiana prior to World War I. And like many young men of his generation, answered his nation's call and joins the United States Army during that war and becomes a pilot. He moves up through the ranks after the war, becomes a very successful pilot, and becomes the section chief at the Air Corps Tactical School, which was a key component of the beginnings of our Air Force. That's where the strategies and the beginning of the Air Force occurred. The pursuit section is what we would know today as fighters. So fighter aircraft, that's where Chenault had his specialty and his experience, and does some magnificent things there with Hap Arnold, who will be on this tour later on, and several other air power leaders to set the foundation of what became the greatest Air Force that the world's ever seen. In late 1937, his hearing fails, and he's retired from active military service. In 1940, as the Japanese begin to make inroads into China, Chiang Kai-shek recruits him to set up an air force for the Chinese. And he stands up what is known as the American Volunteer Group, also known as the Flying Tigers. The Flying Tigers lose far more aircraft and members in training. That's how tough Chenault made it than they did in combat. That's so very, very successful air leader.
Yeah.
He is recalled to active duty in 1942 and becomes commander of 14th Air Force, which, among other things, defended the aircraft that flew the hump into China to supply the Chinese forces to keep them alive against the Japanese.
Okay.
And he is buried near the Rose Garden. This is near the Rose Garden of Mrs. Lee's. Mrs. Lee had a beautiful rose garden, and it's still there on the side of the house, Arlington House. And his mother's distant cousin was Robert E. Lee.
Oh,
interestingly.
How about that?
Claire Chenault. Mm-hmm. This is a picture of that garden and Arlington House from the side. American flag, of course, over that. Mm-hmm. And this is this is the front porch. One of the most. I used to sit and at times I would sit on that porch for hours at a time and just look at that, because that is Washington, D.C. You see Memorial Bridge there, and then the Lincoln Memorial. To the right of that is the White House. To the right of that, you see the Washington Monument. You see the Capitol in the distance on the right, and then all the way on the far right, you see the Jefferson Memorial.
And you can see all that from that view.
Yes.
What a view.
One of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Brings back wonderful memories.
Yeah.
Omar Bradley. Omar Bradley commanded the largest military force in American history, the 12th U.S. Army Group in Europe, 1.3 million men. Bill Stettler served under Omar Bradley, just to let folks know, under Patton first, but then also under Omar Bradley ultimately. Omar Bradley was a common, humble man, had some interesting run-ins with this man, George Patton. Initially served under him at the beginning of the war, and later on, after a soldier slapping incident with Patton that many people are probably aware of if you've ever seen the movie Patton. Patton is kind of out of favor, and so Omar Bradley ascends to the command of the forces that will fight the Third Reich and win the war in Europe. Mm-hmm. And Patton ends up serving under him. Oh, okay. So, but a great man, lived, I think, until his 90s. Becomes the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The National Security Act of 1947 creates the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He becomes the first chairman of that, and also becomes a 5-star general, one of 5 people to be a 5-star general. Yeah. I usually at this point, and I won't do this because there's nobody to answer. Well, you guys can answer the questions, but it would take you a while, and we don't have the time. In addition to Omar Bradley, you had Douglas MacArthur, Dwight Eisenhower, George Marshall, and then, of course, Hap Arnold. Those are the 5-star generals of the United States Army.
You think we'll ever see another 5-star general?
I hope not. I hope not, because it would have to be an awfully ugly war.
You're right.
So this is William Rehnquist. So William Rehnquist, you might wonder, why is he on here? He's on here, first of all, because he was there's a number of chief justices and then justices of the Supreme Court that are buried in this area of the cemetery where he's buried. But the primary reason is because he was a member of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
That's right.
So William Rehnquist, I think the longest serving justice, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, appointed, I think, I want to say originally the Supreme Court by President Nixon, and then ascends to the Chief Justice by President Reagan, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, I do have Robert Kennedy on here. I told you I didn't. There we go. Yeah. Okay, so Robert F. Kennedy, a simple white cross. What everybody's more familiar with is JFK, who has the eternal flame, of course, and then Jackie Kennedy is buried there along with him. Yeah. He just wanted a simple white cross, and it's about 20 yards down the path from his brother's grave. My favorite Robert F. Kennedy quote is one that I think we all could take to heart. Some men look at things and ask why. I look at things that never were and say, why not?
Yeah, that is a great quote. Yeah. Now, let me ask you, so he specified that's what he wanted because he died at a young age.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if he specified that, or if it was just conversation with his wife, or if it was well, my brother's buried here, and so I'm going to be buried here as well. So
right.
The word is though that he wanted a simple white cross. So I think maybe he had contemplated that. Who knows?
Sure. Very simple.
Chappie James, General Chappie James, a Tuskegee Airman. Chappie James went from a time in our nation when segregation and discrimination was rampant and not a good thing. He went from a time of that when he was told not to wear his uniform off base so that the white enlisted people did not have to salute him, to a time when he becomes the first 4-star general in the United States Armed Forces from any service. He flies as a Tuskegee Airman during World War II and flies 101 combat missions over Korea. Later, in Vietnam, he flies another 78, and he becomes deputy commander of the famed Wolf Pack, the 8th Fighter Wing in Vietnam. The commander was Robin Olds. Robin Olds was a kind of a renegade, if you will, a bit of a renegade officer, colonel at the time, and then he, of course, became a brigadier general. He was the commander of the Wolf Pack, and together they devised methods to increase our ability, survivability of our aircraft. We didn't have a very good kill ratio at the time. On the Vietnamese, they had a lot more experience. So they devised those tactics and he becomes a legend in the Air Force. They jokingly referred to him and Olds as Black Man and Robin Olds, interestingly. Anyway, this is my favorite quote from General James. After all the difficulties and things that he went through, the racism that he experienced late in his life, this was his quote: "This is my country, and I believe in her, and I will serve her, and I'll contribute to her welfare whenever and however I can. If she has any ills, I'll stand by her until in God's given time, through wisdom and her consideration for the welfare of the entire nation, she will put them right." General James.
Great loyalty.
Absolutely. After all he had been through, that's really something. That's a picture of him and Robin Olds in Vietnam. William Frederick Halsey, also known as Bull Halsey, graduates from the United States Naval Academy in 1898, as I recall, is a fullback on their football team, is a patrol escort officer during World War I, and becomes, as he sees the transition to aircraft carriers, he earns his wings, and he is the oldest member of the United States military ever to earn wings in the military, 52 years old, and becomes the de facto best naval air commander in World War II. Replaces Gormley at Guadalcanal, a pivotal campaign when we turned the tide officially on the Japanese. Was somewhat overly aggressive, many people would say. It caused issues later in his career. He sailed into a typhoon, some other issues, but the Japanese surrendered on his flagship, the battleship Missouri, and he becomes a fleet admiral, so a 5-star admiral, and there are 3 others that received that rank. Nimitz, right up the road in Fredericksburg, right. Also Lutheran as he was growing up. Admiral Leahy, and then Admiral King. So the 5-star fleet admirals. Glenn Alton Miller. Glenn Miller, the band leader, his body I think it was recently recovered, but this is a section of the cemetery that's very, very steep, and they just have markers, so that's why it says in memory of. Glenn Miller was killed in a plane crash over the English Channel as he was going into Paris to set up a concert for the troops, a morale concert, but Glenn Miller was a major. George Marshall, a man for the ages, one of the greatest generals that ever lived. George Marshall was born in the state of Pennsylvania, attends Virginia Military Institute, and becomes General Pershing's chief of staff early in his career. Later on in the 1920s and in between years, one of his fitness reports that included a spot to say whether or not you as a commander would want to serve with this member. This was the quote that his commanding officer put on his report, and I think at the time he was only a captain. I would serve in battle with General Marshall, or I mean not General Marshall, it was Captain Marshall, but I would prefer to serve under his command. There are not 5 officers in the Army better suited to command a division. He should be made a brigadier general. Later on in his career, in 1939, he becomes chief of staff of the Army, and is vital in the ramp up to World War II and making sure our nation was as able as it was, and it wasn't very able, but due to him, MacArthur, Patton, several, in other areas, Hap Arnold, huge in the Air Force, our Army was as ready as it could be, and by the grace of God, we were able to ramp up from there. Mm-hmm. The only career military officer ever given the Nobel Peace Prize, of course, for the Marshall Plan, that won the peace in Europe. People forget, but up until that time, most of the time, the winners of wars were punitive, and you have another war. That's what happened after World War I, really. Yeah. The Versailles Treaty, it crushed the German nation, and it gave rise to Hitler. Right. And then we had World War II. Yeah. But Marshall won the peace, truly won the peace. Yeah. He also served as Secretary of Defense, one of only now 3 officers at the time. He was the first to be exempted from the moratorium on a military officer becoming a Secretary of Defense within 7 years of their retirement. Wow. Had to be approved by Congress, and it was. Since then, General Mattis and then General Austin, our current Secretary of Defense, both were exempted. Mm. He is the only person ever to serve as the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General George Marshall. Mm-hmm. John Lejeune, Naval Academy grad. His father was an officer in the Confederate Army. He started out as a naval officer, an engineering officer on ships, but didn't do well with sea duty, and so he crossed over into the Marine Corps. Lucky for us as a nation, because he becomes the father of the United States Marine Corps. Commands, first Marine ever to command an Army division during World War I, and becomes the 13th Commandant of the Marine Corps from 1920 to 1929. He modifies the Marine Corps from being simply naval infantry into what we today call a 911 force, 9/11 force, where we have a combined arms capability in the Marines. We have tanks, we have infantry, we have special forces, we have air, and we can insert them anywhere in the world. And it's a combined force that knows each other and is able to take care of whatever we need taken care of. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So John Lejeune. Jimmy Doolittle, one of the great air pioneers. Doolittle leaves college during World War I to join the Air Force and become, or the Army Air Corps, becomes a flight instructor at various places, including Kelly Air Force Base right here in San Antonio. Becomes a great military and civilian pilot, wins numerous awards and flies numerous groundbreaking flights. Brilliant man. He was essentially an aeronautical engineer, one of the first, joins the reserves. He doesn't stay active duty, but becomes as the war in Europe kicks off, or actually the World War II, he rejoins. He's recalled to active duty, and comes up during a very difficult time after the time of Pearl Harbor. We had no way of striking back at Japan, and he devises a plan to put medium bombers on a carrier and figures out that they can just barely take off, and sells the plan. And then under great secrecy, it leaves San Francisco with the bombers, the Admiral Melcher, and gets as close as it can to Japan. And Doolittle flies those. He and his men fly those aircraft off, and bomb several cities in Japan. Mm-hmm. Lifts the spirit of the nation like you would not believe. Tactically, barely scratched the Japanese, but strategically a massive win, because it forced the Japanese to come out of what they called their defensive littoral perimeter. It was their strategy to basically bleed us dry and then make peace on their terms somewhere. Right. But it forced them to come out of that, and that extension was what enabled us to find vulnerabilities and then defeat the Japanese.
Uh-huh.
That's a picture of him and Admiral Melcher shortly before he retired, or he left the carrier. Lee Marvin, actor. Just a real quick, he's buried near General Doolittle. He was in the Marine Corps, and he was granted at the time that it was there was more flexible burial regulations, and Lee Marvin decided he wanted to be buried there. That is a picture of me in front of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Needless to say, one of the greatest honors of my life.
Yeah.
I always like to remind folks at this point that the flag in our sanctuary that was flown over the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier on the day that our current sanctuary was dedicated. I was able to arrange that. So when you look up at that flag, hopefully that'll bring back some memories of our troops in Arlington.
Oh, that is really special.
Audie Murphy from the great state of Texas.
Yeah.
Says it right on the gravestone, of course. The Marine Corps, he applies for the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps won't take him, so he joins the Army and becomes a legendary soldier during World War II. One of the most decorated veterans of all time, wins the Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross. Those are the top two awards that we award. Silver Star with an oak leaf cluster, that means 2 silver stars. Bronze Star with an oak leaf cluster. Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. So in a very short period of time, about 3-4 years, he wins all of those awards. Has some troubled times as he grows older. He played himself in a movie about himself in Hollywood. He was in several Westerns, but his experience in the war haunts him later in life, and he has some difficult times, but survives those and ends up dying near, I think, Roanoke, Virginia, in a plane crash. I think he was flying the aircraft. I vaguely remember that from when I was a kid. Audie Murphy. This is a beautiful spot. This is on a beautiful fall day. This is the section where our nurses are buried. Oh. So this entire section is nurses and some medical folks. Those 2 gravestones are General Pershing and his grandson, who was killed in Vietnam as a first lieutenant. And they basically overlook this area where World War I veterans are buried. Okay. And that's the next one we're going to go to, General Pershing's grave. General Pershing was given the title of General of the Armies after World War I, after his magnificent performance there. The only other member of the military to be given that rank was George Washington. George Washington originally refused to accept it, and Congress, and so they stopped it because George Washington said this isn't going to happen until around the 1970s, when Congress got around to realizing that that made Pershing number 1 on the rolls of the United States Army as the senior ranking officer in history. Right. And at that point, they passed not a law, but a bill that said George Washington is General of the Armies, so that George Washington is now number 1.
As long as George Washington
stays number one, right? Yeah. So interesting little tidbit. He graduates from West Point as a young man and wins the Silver Star in the Spanish-American War. Previous to that, he was commander of the 10th Cavalry, the famous 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers that fought the Indian Wars. And if you're familiar with the Buffalo Soldiers, that was the entire regiment essentially was black cavalry. And that's how he got his nickname, Blackjack, because he was the commander of the Buffalo Soldiers. Instrumental in maintaining the integrity of American forces under American command during World War I. That's lived until today. When we arrived in Europe, the British generals and the French generals tried to piecemeal our forces where they needed them and put them in with their forces. And Pershing said, no, American forces will only be commanded by American officers. He dies in 1948, and his funeral procession is led by a man who served as a captain in Europe under him by the name of Harry Truman, then president.
Okay.
Hap Arnold. Hap Arnold is he's the father of the United States Air Force, another from the state of Pennsylvania. Graduates from West Point and becomes the 29th licensed pilot in the history of the United States. Taught to fly by The Wright brothers, of course.
Really?
Yeah. So the Wright brothers taught Hap Arnold to fly.
Ah.
He is instrumental in many things during World War I as in the Air Force. Head of the Army Aviation School in World War I. And again, as I said, becomes the father of the United States Air Force. Becomes the chief of the Air Corps in 1938. And again, he is to the Air Force what MacArthur and Marshall and Patton were for the Army in advocating for tanks and infantry in the various branches of our military. Mm-hmm. Big influencer of aircraft production and design. The only general of the Air Force. So when the Air Force was created, Congress passed an act that said, okay, General Arnold, because he was a general of the Army, he will become the first general of the Air Force. So the only man to ever serve that rank, actually to hold that rank, he didn't serve. And then the only man to have the 5-star rank in 2 different services.
Oh, okay.
Hap Arnold. There's a picture of Hap Arnold in one of the posters. This is the end. So the end of this presentation, I think we probably went a little long. This is the Iwo Jima Memorial, one of the most inspirational and beautiful memorials ever built, and it's right outside the gate of Arlington.
Uh-huh.
So that sums it up, Pastor.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful. And I can certainly see not just your knowledge, but your love and your passion for our nation and for the history of our military. Fascinating history.
Absolutely.
And we just scratched the surface.
Yeah. And again, this is about half or a little bit less than half. I sprinted through it really, and I'm happy to provide this tour to anybody. You know, I've given it in the past to school kids and various organizations. Happy to do it if anybody out there has a group of people that they'd like me to provide this to. I would love to. It's a great honor.
Okay, so there's this and there's much more.
Yes.
So you've heard it. He's made an offer. If anybody's interested, there is more. And if it's as good as that, then I know it's excellent. So thank you so much, Mark. That was just
my privilege.
Fantastic.
My privilege. Thank you, Pastor.
And thank you so much for being with us today on the Shepherd Podcast. Please tune in next time as we continue to introduce you to people in our church and share their lives and their experiences with you. Until then, the Lord's blessings to you. May He keep you healthy and safe and give you great joy. See you next time.